How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 54th video on the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the process philosophers. Last time, we looked at Alfred North Whitehead and his lecture Importance. In today's episode, we're now going to shift our focus across the English Channel, or the Atlantic rather, and onto the work of Henri Bergson, particularly his introduction to metaphysics. Without further ado, let's get into it. Bergson begins by drawing a distinction between two things he'll soon come to call intuition and analysis. In his eyes, there are two ways of knowing a thing that can be gleaned from examining different strands of metaphysics and the way philosophers deal with the absolute. In the first case, it's a question of examining something from the outside, as if going round it, as Bergson says. In the second, on the other hand, we enter directly into the object in question. To borrow his words,
the first depends on the point of view at which we are placed and on the symbols by which we express ourselves. The second neither depends on a point of view nor relies on any symbol.
The first can only know a thing relatively, connected to the symbols that are used to translate it, whilst the second is able to understand that same object absolutely. At this point, Bergson spends the vast majority of the section giving examples showing this division in practice. Let's take a character in a book, for instance. No matter how many descriptions, traits, and so on that the author puts in, nothing can allow that character to be understood as completely as when the reader themselves sympathizes with them. As can be seen in this diagram, the same holds true for photographing a town. Even if you took a picture from every single angle, that still wouldn't be enough to allow someone to grasp it in its essence, what truly constitutes it. Those images only act as symbols that can never completely coincide with the absoluteness of a living, breathing town that we can walk around in. The same holds true for a poem. No matter how hard you try to create a perfect copy from translations, layering the one upon the other is never enough. The original, with its inner meaning, will always escape. The reason for this lies in the fact that symbols can never truly encapsulate something. Instead, they can only relate things together relatively. Those photos give certain perspectives, but they can't capture the true nature of a town, because that's all they are, perspectives. No matter how hard you try, you always miss out on the dynamic flow of people, time, and so on. To go back to the example of the author and the character, as Bergson himself puts it,
symbols and points of view, therefore, place me outside the character. They give me only what he has in common with others, and not what belongs to him and to him alone.
To get to this essential point, we have to employ intuition, which he defines here as a kind of intellectual sympathy that allows us to get inside an object and coincide with what makes it unique and the elements that find themselves unexpressible through the other form of knowledge, analysis. For Bergson, an analysis is always one ad infinitum, since you have to constantly add new points of view and symbols to try, always in vain, to grasp the object absolutely. This is something he demonstrates with the action of raising an arm. For the person doing it is quite simple. Through intuition, they experience a simple perception from within. It isn't difficult to grasp in its totality. It moves from A to B. However, for an observer stuck on analysis, it's a different story. Here, they might measure the motion in symbols, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, etc. But this is only relative. You can break it down into millimeters, which in turn might become micrometers. It's like the coastline of Britain as studied by Mandelbrot, where the smaller the unit, the larger the object. Analysis breaks down because all symbols only mean something in relation to other symbols, not in relation to the object itself. However, this isn't to say that analysis is bad in any way. It has its place, particularly in what Bergson describes as the positive sciences. Rather, the point that he's trying to make is that we aren't at all restrained to it alone. We can know things through intuition, something that is central to metaphysics. As he says of an object,
if there exists a means of seizing it without any translation or symbolic representation, metaphysics is that means. Metaphysics, then, is the science which claims to dispense with symbols.
Here, Bergson introduces the concept of duration, one of his most important ideas alongside intuition. For every single person, he says, there's at least one reality that we can grasp through intuition, our own personality as it flows through time. Nevertheless, this can sometimes be a bit difficult to realize, as there's always a kind of crust of symbols that hides the durating core. To explain this, Bergson gives a step-by-step account of self-contemplation. This operation begins, as represented in this diagram, through a discovery of perceptions from the material world. For example, smells, sights, and so on, that tend to group together and form objects. Next, passing through, we find memories that link up and interlace with those perceptions. This is followed up by a set of virtual actions, that is to say, things like tendencies and habits that are related to and actualized by perceptions and memories. However, this only makes up the surface. There's more below. In particular, there's a kind of flux, one that can't be compared to anything else. This is duration, something that functions through a kind of succession of states that all interpenetrate. At first glance, it might seem that we can picture this as the unrolling of a coil on the one hand, and the rolling up of a thread on the other. In the first case, there's the fact that we live to grow old. A role in life eventually comes to an end, where we run out of coil. In the second case, there's the fact that our past follows us, and thus makes our inner life swell up. However, as Bergson says,
but actually it is neither an unrolling nor a rolling up, for these two similes evoke the idea of lines and surfaces whose parts are homogeneous and superposable on one another.
Instead, duration is completely heterogeneous. No two moments are ever the same. Memory makes sure that. To borrow from Deleuze, Proust's narrator in The Search doesn't construct an image of Combray when he eats his Madeleine in the same fashion as its actual equivalent. Rather, there's a fundamental difference involved. Even outside of the obviously different context, the repetition of eating itself involves a new significance put upon it by the past experience. No sensation can remain identical. The problem with duration is that it's basically impossible to get a complete picture. By definition, it's only knowable through intuition, and thus can't be fully expressed through symbols. Another example Bergson gives deals with a spectrum composed from many colors. Here, every shade runs into others, producing the effect of a constant succession that holds the key to colors past and future in the areas between them. Nevertheless, this fails because it's spatialized. It's given as a complete thing, no flux involved. The final example he gives is of an elastic object being stretched endlessly. For him, this looks a bit more promising, since the focus is on movement alone. However, even it doesn't really work, since it ignores the richness of color, or other qualities, that define duration. To quote from Bergson once again,
"The inner life is all this at once, variety of qualities, continuity of progress, and unity of direction. It cannot be represented by images."
Nevertheless, images are still better than concepts, which he defines as abstract, general, or simple ideas. Those metaphors and similes he used weren't perfect, they're symbols after all, but they don't pretend to step in for the object itself. Concepts, on the other hand, do. In a way almost reminiscent of Deleuze, Bergson describes how they can only build resemblances based on abstract similarities. They destroy the heterogeneity of duration through generalization, making it applicable to an infinite amount of objects. Bergson is careful to differentiate between intuition and concepts, saying that it's necessary to transcend the latter in order to reach the former. Concepts are undeniably necessary, but they can't be rigid and ready-made. Instead, Bergson calls for a more fluid approach, something that moves with intuition rather than bogging it down in symbols. For the moment, he drops this point, but promises to return to it later on. Instead, his focus now shifts toward the idea of duration being a multiplicity. This is a central concept in Bergson's work, one borrowed from the differential geometry of Bernhard Riemann, and further developed by Gilles Deleuze. Essentially, it refers to a collection of elements that can be either quantitative in the case of space, or qualitative in the case of time. There are some major differences between these two types of multiplicity. For example, elements in the former are separated, yet juxtaposed, whilst elements in the latter bleed into one another, sort of coexisting. Although it's impossible for me to really diagram a qualitative one, this is an example of a quantitative multiplicity, using Bergson's favorite demonstration, that of sheep in a herd. qualities here don't matter. Instead, each sheep is made homogeneous so that they can be counted up. For Bergson, duration is a qualitative multiplicity. However, due to its encroaching and therefore continuous nature, there is quite a complex question that we must necessarily answer. To what extent can be considered to have unity as well? On the one hand, every element of a multiplicity involves itself in other elements, so that there aren't any real gaps like you find in discrete things. On the other hand, as Bergson himself puts it,
this moving, changing, colored, living unity has hardly anything in common with the abstract, motionless, and empty unity, which the concept of pure unity circumscribes.
When confronted with the problem of whether to call it a multiplicity still or instead shift to unity, Bergson responds that, well, duration is both at the same time. This only works, though, if we go beyond the rigid concepts of unity and multiplicity, which oppose each other, and instead grasp them by placing ourselves inside duration via an act of intuition. Turning now to the problems that stem from confusing this with analysis, he sets out a critique of philosophers who use cycle states, things like happiness, anger, what have you, to reconstruct personality. An isolated cycle state, in his eyes, is nothing more than a note, artificially raised to the level of a symbol. Using the example of someone drawing tons upon tons of sketches based on Paris, he says that it can only be made into something whole through intuition. If someone has already been to Paris, those images might be enough to do something with. However, for someone who hasn't, it simply doesn't work. There's no way to get an accurate impression of what the city is like. Those sketches, just like cycle states, aren't even true parts of some whole. They're rather only partial expressions. When it comes to philosophy, Bergson takes aim at two main schools, that of the empiricists and that of the rationalists. To give a quick rundown, empiricism holds that knowledge comes primarily from experience, whilst rationalism sees reason itself as the source. In terms of the first, he accuses Taine and Stuart Mill of being psychologists in their method, in the sense that they isolate things that can only be experienced through intuition, for example, personality, as symbols for analysis, individual cycle states. To borrow his own words,
they desire an intuition, and by a strange inconsistency, they seek this intuition in analysis, which is the very negation of it.
However, this isn't the only philosophy to blame. Rationalism falls for the exact same thing, considering cycle states as fragments that make up some sort of whole in the form of the ego or self. In both systems, Bergson says, we find an effort to try and fuse these many symbols, these partial expressions, together. However, the fundamental difference between empiricism and rationalism, in his eyes at least, is that the former eventually gives up and insists that the self is a multiplicity, for example, one which has many different avenues for experience, whilst the latter instead declares it to be a unity, reason over all. For Bergson, the gap between the two philosophies is thus mostly just surface level. However, he does say that they are necessarily doomed. At this point, he turns his attention to what he calls a true empiricism. This is something that tries to get as close as possible to the self through adhering to intuition. It's a difficult position, because by intuition's nature, ready-made concepts just won't do. Instead, it's necessary to create singular notions that describe one thing and one thing only, something that would allow metaphysics to overcome the often illusory differences between schools of thought. Going back to the self, we can't just use multiplicity and unity in their general sense. As he says, mingling them doesn't get us any closer to grasping its enduring nature. To illustrate this, he gives the example of a cone. We can see it expanding indefinitely in one direction, and narrowing into nothingness in the other. But juxtaposing those two states over one another just doesn't give us any idea of what a cone actually is. The same thing holding true for duration. Turning back to concepts as a whole, he writes,
concepts, as we have shown elsewhere, generally go together in couples and represent two contraries. There is hardly any concrete reality which cannot be observed from two opposing standpoints.
His example here is the infamous thesis and antithesis that we always struggle to reconcile. In intuition, Bergson argues, we are able to overcome contradictions like these, breaking past the law of the excluded middle. This essentially implies a massive reversal in thinking. Usually, we start from concepts, then pass to things, mixing ready-made notions to create something that approximates reality. When it comes to everyday life, this is all well and good. However, to do the same thing with philosophy is a mistake for reasons we've already seen. To use concepts is to use symbols, is to use analysis. With this, we're back to where we started. The main focus now, though, is fluctuation. In Bergson's eyes, things like concepts, when perceived through the lens of analysis, are always static. Duration, on the other hand, is defined by its ever-changing and continuous nature. As he says of cycle states, there are none that aren't influenced by the past behind them. It in duration prolongs the past into the present, dealing with a kind of perpetual becoming that has no real target. Nevertheless, we have to be careful when thinking about this becoming. We can isolate it, Bergson saying,
"Becoming in general is a becoming which is not the becoming of any particular thing, and this is what I have called the time the state occupies."
However, in this case, it's no longer something that durates. Instead, becoming in general is an abstract form of time, like anything that undergoes analysis. It becomes homogeneous and spatialized, in the sense that it can be divided up into symbols like seconds, minutes, and so on, that are all identical to one another, just like a kilometer can be broken down into meters. To work with this becoming, we have to keep two things in mind at all times: that it is a tool for comparing durations, and that it is detached from the ego that actually durates. What we find by isolating becoming is that the line between analysis and intuition is rather thin. Here is something that, by all accounts, falls into the domain of the latter, but studying it in this way, we find that it can be taken into the former. Overall, though, the fundamental difference between the two is that intuition is movement, whilst analysis is stasis. Moreover, as Bergson himself puts it,
As we have already said, and may as well repeat here, from intuition one can pass to analysis, but not from analysis to intuition.
At this point, Bergson's attention shifts to the relationship between movement and space. He outlines quite a shocking idea. The latter is never a part of the former. Take a body moving down a number line. As it travels, we can imagine certain places where it stops, certain numbers that it passes through. However, these numbers are not actually connected to the movement itself. They're more like snapshots than anything else, projected onto the moving body, but never actually coinciding with it. The question this gives rise to is how we can construct a thing out of this. For Bergson, there is a deep-seated illusion that permeates almost everyone who thinks about movement and the time that represents it. As he says, we can't just help but consider analysis as equivalent to intuition. We have a tendency to endlessly increase the number of points in a space in order to approximate the moving body, which, just like charting the coastline of Britain, is an endless task. To quote from him once again,
"The positions of the moving body are not parts of the movement. They are points of the space which is supposed to underlie the movement."
The space made up from these points is nothing more than a symbol, something that responds to our most ingrained ways of thinking, as just discussed. There are many problems and paradoxes that have sprung up from the confusion this all causes, which what Deleuze calls badly analyzed composites in Bergsonism, and which essentially involve a mix-up of differences in kind. We talk about time and space as if they're one and the same, as if we could transfer things from the one into the other. However, as Bergson argues, there's necessarily a division between them. Again, he isn't bashing analysis or anything like that. He acknowledges that practical knowledge only really has to enumerate things. Problems arise only when we try to get to their innermost nature. Metaphysics is first and foremost a struggle to try to place yourself inside the object being studied, and to pass not from concepts to reality, but from reality to concepts. Nevertheless, this basis in intuition doesn't at all mean that the philosopher should only contemplate themselves and their own duration. Rather, to do so would be to make a grave mistake, since, as he says,
"It would be to misconceive the singular nature of duration, and at the same time the essentially active, I might say almost violent, character of metaphysical intuition."
The central reason lies in the fact that intuition isn't just a single act, but a series of them. Analyzing it leads to the paradoxical opposite viewpoint we looked at earlier. On the thesis side, there's a multiplicity of successive states. On the antithesis side, there's a unity binding them together. Pure duration becomes a synthesis of the two, producing a general homogeneous concept that ignores its singular, colorful nature. We can only think intuition with intuition, at least if we want to preserve its heterogeneity. Expanding on his critique of an analytic duration, Bergson says that, as a multiplicity, it falls apart as a collection of powdery moments that can't endure. When thought of as a unity in the same way, it all becomes static, a kind of deathly eternity, as Bergson calls it. We can also place ourselves in the flux of it all, something that will allow us to enter into contact with all sorts of other durations, and to move towards another type of eternity, one much more alive than its spatialized opposite. For Bergson, the two eternities essentially act as extreme limits that intuition fluctuates between, metaphysics being the study of its movement. At this point, he seeks to examine a series of propositions that he sees as central to his philosophy. The first states that there is a reality that is external and yet given immediately to the mind. Secondly, cementing his role as a process philosopher, he states that this reality is movement itself, rest and stillness only ever being apparent or relative. To borrow his words,
all reality, therefore, is tendency, if we agree to mean by tendency an incipient change of direction.
Moving on to his third proposition, he sees the primary purpose of the mind as the representation of things and states. In other words, it takes snapshots of movement and substitutes in immobility. This is necessary for all sorts of things, like language, common sense, positive science, and what he terms practical life. However, as we've seen again and again, this leads to the very essence of things escaping us. The fourth proposition is concerned with just this fact. Metaphysics is a struggle because we employ analysis naturally. All sorts of problems arise as we try to reconstruct reality out of a collection of static pictures, just like in the case of sketches of Paris from earlier. Dogmatism is the result of trying to hold on to analysis as method. Proposition 5 simply remarking that this is always doomed to failure. Taking from the text,
but because we fail to reconstruct the living reality with stiff and ready-made concepts, it does not follow that we cannot grasp it in some other way.
Intuition is extremely difficult, since the mind essentially has to do violence to itself by reversing our ordinary ways of thinking, but it's still possible. This is proposition 6, complemented by number 7, which states that such an inversion hasn't yet been properly practiced, at least in philosophy itself. In other fields, like mathematics, there are things like infinitesimal calculus that achieve it. However, these still hold fast to symbols in a way that metaphysics can't. Nevertheless, Bergson still sees the lesson of calculus as valuable to philosophy, although not in any way that would approximate the hoped-for kind of universal mathematics. Instead, he says that it should take the form of studying qualitative differentiations and integrations, no longer tied to magnitudes or space. In Proposition 8, Bergson explains that the reason why this object too often gets covered up is due to the fact that intuition must always find a way to be expressed. Unfortunately, the usual path leads to us having to conform with those habits of thought that he's in a process of critiquing, which we have to escape if we ever want to be able to grasp something absolutely. This takes us into the final proposition that's under discussion in this essay, number 9. The object of exploration here is a principle that Bergson says began with Plato and culminated in Plotinus. Essentially, it states that there is more in the immutable than in the moving, and the passage from something stable to something unstable is only a decrease in degree. As he has argued throughout, it's actually the opposite that's the case. Taking a detour to examine science, Bergson states that it truly took off once what was mobile was given an independent reality. It dates
from the day when Galileo, setting a ball rolling down an inclined plane, firmly resolved to study this movement for itself, in itself, instead of seeking its principle in the concepts of high and low.
However, he warns that when the intuition of duration is exposed to understanding, it often dries out and turns into fixed, immobile concepts. This is a direct result of human nature, something that metaphysics, in his eyes at least, must come to transcend. The question that Bergson raises now is how masters of philosophy historically failed to recognize the importance of movement and to place themselves in duration. As he sees it, a large chunk of metaphysics has become folded in a rich collection of symbols, forgetting the importance of doing away with them as argued in the very beginning of his essay. In quite eloquent words, he relates that
we might believe that the metaphysicians have dug a deep tunnel beneath reality, that the scientists have thrown an elegant bridge over it, but that the moving stream of things passes between them.
However, this isn't a necessary fact that we have to resign ourselves to. Analysis is first and foremost based on intuition. Every single one of us, even if we aren't aware of it, make use of intuition as a faculty. Concluding the essay, Bergson now turns to writing as an exemplar. Even once the topic has been studied, all the materials collected, and the notes have been made, something else is needed to bring it all together. Just like with the sketches of Paris, you have to place yourself deep inside the subject and find a certain kind of impulse. This allows us to push forward and analyze everything anew, breaking it all down into new details that can go on forever. This is pure movement, something that can be infinitely actualized, which also disappears as soon as we try to grasp it as a thing, and is, at the end of the day, completely simple. It works much the same way for metaphysics, just here it isn't notes or documents, but the many observations and experiences found through science. As Bergson says,
we do not obtain an intuition from reality, that is, an intellectual sympathy with the most intimate part of it, unless we have won the confidence by a long fellowship with its superficial manifestations.
The end result of combining and fusing all these pieces together is the possibility of exposing what he calls their bare materiality. Even in the case of knowing yourself through intuition, you can only get to the durating core by combining and comparing a myriad of psychological analyses. In Bergson's eyes, the masters of modern philosophy were such only through being able to assimilate all those different facets of science around them. However, as he's quick to nuance, although intuition in its metaphysical form can only come from materiality, that doesn't mean that it's equivalent to it. It is, by definition, different in kind. Bergson concludes by stating,
in this sense, metaphysics has nothing in common with the generalization of facts, and nevertheless it might be defined as integral experience.
Now, with this, we're done with Henri Bergson's essay An Introduction to Metaphysics, with an understanding of some of the many facets of duration and intuition. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at a book by Gilles Deleuze, fittingly titled Bergsonism. Until then, bye!